My name is Chloe Miller, and at 24, I stood under the spotlight of Westfield University's graduation stage. A sea of applause surrounded me, but all I saw were two faces in the crowd, my parents. Silent, frozen. They weren't proud, they were shocked. The same people who told me, "You're not like Sophia. We're not wasting money on someone who won't make it." That night, I didn't cry. I didn't fight. I just made a promise. If they think I'm not worthy, I'll prove them wrong. And here I am, valedictorian, business founder, survivor. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Stay with me, because this story might be yours too. The applause roared, but none of it reached me. I stood at the podium, holding the mic with steady hands, but my mind was elsewhere. In the third row, David and Sarah Miller, my parents, sat stiffly, their faces unreadable. They didn't clap, they didn't smile. I wasn't expecting love from them, but the coldness still stung. All I could think about was that night, 5 years ago, when both Sophia and I got accepted into Westfield. Her letter was framed within minutes, shared across family group chats, met with hugs and celebration. Mine, left untouched on the kitchen counter for days, like a piece of junk mail. I had gotten into the same school, on my own merit. But somehow that didn't matter. What did matter, apparently, was that Sophia had always been the golden child. She played piano. I doodled in sketchbooks, she joined clubs, I worked part-time. She was graceful, I was too intense. For years, I thought if I just worked harder, smiled more, kept my grades perfect, they'd finally see me, really see me. But nothing hit harder than that conversation. Dad, with a hand on his coffee mug, eyes fixed elsewhere, had said, "We've decided to pay for Sophia's tuition. You'll need to figure something else out." No emotion, no apology, just a. That night, I sat in the dark, knees pulled to my chest, and in that quiet, a strange calm settled over me. Not sadness, not rage, but resolve. I would not beg, I would not shrink. If they believed I wasn't enough, I would become more than they could imagine. And so I did, working late-night shifts while taking full-course loads, sleeping 4 hours a night, applying for every scholarship I could find, selling handmade stationery online to keep up with rent. I didn't have backup, I didn't have birthday calls, but I had that fire. Now, as the dean introduced me with a list of accomplishments, academic awards, my startup, leadership roles, I saw it in their faces, shock, guilt, maybe shame. And I didn't smile out of spite. I smiled because I no longer needed anything from them. Their approval, their support, their love. I had become my own source of worth. And today, I was standing in the one place they swore I'd never reach. They never said it out loud, not once. But I felt it, in the way they looked at her, the way their faces lit up whenever she entered a room, and the way mine barely registered. Sophia, my little sister, was the sun, and I was whatever didn't shine. She was 3 years younger, but I faded next to her before she could even spell her name. I remember when she won a Cutest Smile award in preschool. My mom printed the certificate, laminated it, and taped it on the fridge for weeks. I had just gotten into the school's advanced reading program, and all I got was a half nod during breakfast. Sophia's 5th birthday party was the moment everything clicked. Fairy lights, tiara, a 3-tier cake shaped like a castle, even a pony for the kids to ride. I handed her a card I'd made from folded construction paper and glitter glue. I'd worked on it secretly at night, cutting stars by hand. "Did you forget to get her a real gift?" Dad asked. He chuckled like it was harmless. It wasn't. Mom took the card, barely looked at it, then passed it to the gift table behind her. I stood alone most of that afternoon, watching Sophia laugh with the magician, while everyone cooed at how special she was. That was the word they used a lot. Special. She was special. I was solid, quiet, dependable. The one who didn't need attention. Dinner times were worse. Every conversation was about her, her classes, her piano teacher, the new dance routine she was learning. I once mentioned I got an A+ on a history essay I worked on for 2 weeks. "That's good," Dad mumbled, without looking up. Then he turned to Sophia. "Show us your recital piece." I remember bringing home a watercolor painting, my first art show entry at school. It was a lake at dusk, the kind I used to dream about running to. I stood at the front door holding it up, grinning. Mom barely glanced. "That's nice. Now go wash your hands for dinner." She got rewarded for existing. I had to earn permission to be acknowledged. Even then, I barely made the cut. Still, I kept trying. I woke up early, cleaned the kitchen without being asked, studied hard, smiled more, spoke less. Maybe if I made things easier for them, they'd finally love me a little louder. But deep down, I was starting to understand something terrifying. No matter what I did, I'd always be second place in a race I never signed up for. Being ignored isn't loud like yelling. It's quiet, it's slow, but it leaves cracks in your bones you won't notice until years later, when everything starts to collapse. Middle school was when the comparisons stopped being subtle and started becoming routine. It wasn't just about who was more talkative or prettier anymore. It was about grades, attitude, clothes, hobbies, how we sat, how we smiled, how we breathed. I remember the first time it stung like a slap. At a parent-teacher night in 7th grade, my math teacher greeted Dad with, "Chloe has improved a lot. She's one of the top students in class now." I stood a little taller, hoping he'd smile, maybe say something nice. Instead, he asked, "But how's Sophia doing in your class?" The teacher hesitated. "Sophia's in 6th grade. She's not in my class." Dad laughed it off. "Oh, right. Well, she's always been sharp with numbers." That was it. My best report card meant less than a memory of Sophia's potential. At home, it continued. "Why don't you brush your hair like your sister?" "Your tone is too harsh." Sophia speaks gently. "Your room's always a mess." Sophia knows how to keep things tidy. It didn't matter what I did right. What mattered was that it wasn't what Sophia would have done. I loved to draw. I'd spend hours sketching characters, designing little fantasy worlds. I once stayed up until 2 a.m. working on a full-color comic book about 2 sisters traveling through time. When I showed it to Mom, she flipped through a few pages and said, "It's cute, but you know art doesn't pay the bills, right? You should study something serious, like Sophia's doing." That night, I tore the comic book in half and shoved it in the back of my closet. It didn't stop there. I joined the school's business club. I organized a fundraiser that brought in double the goal. Our advisor even wrote me a glowing letter of recommendation. When I told Dad, he said, "That's nice, but did you hear? Sophia got invited to that youth science conference in Boston." I hadn't. I didn't even know she applied. But suddenly, my victory felt like a consolation prize. I started shrinking, not physically, but emotionally. I stopped showing them things. I stopped talking about school. I stopped trying to win a game that was clearly rigged. At night, I lay awake, wondering if I was crazy, if I was being petty, or jealous, or dramatic. But deep down, I knew. There was a kind of love you didn't have to earn. Sophia had that. And there was the kind you chased forever, but never caught, mine. Over time, I started disappearing, not just from their attention, but from myself, like a photo fading in sunlight. until eventually I stopped looking for their eyes altogether, because nothing was more painful than watching them light up for someone else. By the time I reached high school, I had learned the art of trying without expectation. I knew praise wasn't coming, but still I hoped, quietly, secretly, that maybe one day something I did would make them pause. Look, say something kind, anything. So I tried harder. I became the girl who never forgot chores, who always said please and thank you, who asked if mom needed help with groceries even when my back ached from school. I did it all without complaint, because somewhere deep down, I believed effort would eventually equal love. One night, I stayed up late making lasagna from scratch. I followed the recipe step by step, even grated cheese by hand. I set the table with candles and folded napkins like I'd seen in magazines. When Mom walked in, her eyes scanned the room once, then landed on the lasagna. "Did Sophia help you?" she asked, slipping off her heels. "No," I said. "I made it for you." She muttered something like, and disappeared into the bathroom. Dinner passed in silence. Another weekend, I woke up early and cleaned the entire house. I scrubbed the kitchen tile with a toothbrush, organized the pantry, even rearranged the bookshelf by author and genre. When Dad came home, he looked around and said, "Didn't Sophia say she was going to clean this weekend?" "I did it," I answered. He nodded, looked toward the corner of the room, and added, "You missed a spot behind the couch." That was it. "No, thank you. No, this looks amazing. Just correction." As if I hadn't done enough, because in their eyes, I never did. I remember the first time I tried to talk about it. We were in the car, and I asked softly, "Do you ever notice that you praise Sophia a lot more than me?" Mom glanced at me like I'd just told her the sky was green. "Don't be dramatic, Chloe. We treat you both the same. You're just more independent." It felt like a slap wrapped in sugar. From then on, I stopped bringing things up, stopped showing them my report cards, my artwork, even my small wins at school. I learned to keep my joy quiet, because loud joy without an audience only echoes. I started shrinking, not in size, but in spirit. At school, teachers said I was brilliant. At home, I was background noise. And the worst part, I started believing it. Because when love is conditional, when affection is rationed, and when praise only flows one direction, you stop reaching for it. You settle into the silence. You learn how to disappear, even while standing right in front of them. When college acceptance letters arrived, I thought, maybe, just maybe, this would finally be the moment they saw me. Sophia and I had both applied to Westfield University. I remember us sitting side by side in the living room, refreshing our emails. Her notification came first. She screamed. Mom rushed in. Dad popped the sparkling cider. They danced around the kitchen like she'd just won an Olympic medal. They printed her acceptance letter and taped it to the fridge, posted it on Facebook, called every relative we had. Mine came 30 minutes later. I smiled. I even laughed a little. I had gotten in, full tuition scholarship, no one noticed. I set the letter down on the coffee table and walked out of the room. I waited. I counted the minutes. 10, 20, an hour. Nothing. At dinner, no one said a word about it. The next day, I brought it up. "I got in too," I said, sliding the paper across the table. Dad looked over it briefly. "That's great," he said, then turned back to his phone. No hug, no toast, no fridge space. A week later, Dad called me into the kitchen. Mom stood beside him with that look she always wore when something uncomfortable was coming. Mouth tight, arms crossed, eyes already avoiding mine. "We've talked," Dad began. And we've decided to financially support Sophia's education. She's chosen pre-med, and we believe that's the best long-term investment. I stared at him. We know you got a scholarship, Mom added quickly. You're practical. You'll figure things out. You always do. They said it like it was a compliment, like independence was a badge I'd earned, instead of something they forced me to wear since I was 12. You understand, right? She asked, like the conversation was already over. And just like that, it was done. They hadn't raised their voices. They hadn't said I wasn't worthy. But silence can carry more weight than 1,000 insults. I stood there with the letter still in my hand, suddenly feeling like a guest in my own life. I wanted to say something, anything, but my voice was trapped behind the realization that they hadn't even considered me. I went upstairs, closed the door, and sat on my bed in the dark. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I accepted it. Not because it didn't hurt, God it did, but because the part of me that needed their approval finally died. I packed for college like I was preparing for exile. Ziplocked my essentials, counted every dollar, researched bus routes, scholarship forms, food banks near campus. And when I walked out that door in August, they waved from the porch like it was any other goodbye. They thought they were sending me off to struggle. But they didn't realize they hadn't pushed me away. They had accidentally set me free. College was supposed to feel like escape, but at first it just felt cold. My dorm room smelled like dust and paint. 2 beds, 2 desks, 1 window that didn't quite shut. I arrived alone. No parents helping with bags, no teary goodbyes. Just me, dragging 2 worn-out suitcases up 3 flights of stairs. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank white wall. It looked like possibility. It also looked like emptiness. My scholarship covered tuition, but not rent, not meals, not books, not life. So I hustled. Within days, I had 3 part-time jobs, pouring lattes at 6 a.m., tutoring high school kids at night, and organizing books at the campus library on weekends. I studied in between, ate cheap instant noodles and rationed toilet paper. Most nights, I came back to the dorm after midnight, shoes soaked in rain, spine aching, brain buzzing. I'd collapse into bed fully dressed, still holding a textbook. I'd wake up to my alarm 5 hours later and do it again. No one from home ever called, not even once. Mom didn't ask if I was eating. Dad didn't ask about my grades. Sophia posted selfies from wine bars and brunch cafes, her smile framed by the arms of the people who used to ignore mine. I muted her posts, then I deleted the app altogether. I wasn't jealous, I was raw. I couldn't bear the proof that they were doing just fine without me, that maybe they never noticed I was gone. Some nights I sat on the floor of the dorm bathroom, hugging my knees, shaking from exhaustion. Once I passed out while shelving books and woke up in the campus infirmary with a needle in my arm and no memory of how I got there. The nurse said it was a combination of dehydration, stress, and a fever I'd ignored for too long. "You need to slow down," she said gently. "You can't carry everything alone?" I smiled like I understood, but deep down, I didn't know how to do anything else. I'd been carrying things alone since I was 10. Being the independent one wasn't a badge I chose. It was one they pinned on me when they decided Sophia needed their attention more. But even as my body cracked under pressure, something in me refused to break. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was the tiniest flicker of belief that I was meant for more than just survival. Still, I remember thinking in the haze of sickness and hunger, I don't want to do this alone forever. I didn't say it out loud, but maybe the universe heard, because soon someone would. Not them, but someone who finally would see me. The night I hit my lowest point, it wasn't dramatic. There was no storm, no meltdown, no audience. Just me, sitting on a bench outside the campus library, soaked in freezing rain, staring at my bank balance, $12.47. I hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. My throat burned, my head throbbed, and the paper I had due the next morning still wasn't finished. I felt hollow, not just hungry, but like my body had given up before my mind could admit it. I remember thinking, if I just lie down here and sleep, maybe everything will stop for a bit. That's when my phone buzzed. It was from a number I didn't recognize. "Chloe, it's Grandma Martha. I found your number through your old church directory. I just wanted to hear your voice." I froze. Grandma Martha, my mother's mother. I hadn't seen her in nearly 2 years. She'd moved away after a health scare, and after that, no one really kept in touch. But I remembered her soft hands, her laugh that crackled like dry leaves, and how she used to sneak me extra dessert when Mom wasn't looking. My voice cracked when I answered, "Hi, Grandma." We talked for 20 minutes. She asked nothing about Sophia, nothing about school rankings or scholarships, just, "Are you eating enough? Do you have a coat for this weather? You always did try to do everything yourself, sweet girl." By the time we hung up, I was crying too hard to type. The next morning, a package arrived at my dorm. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf, a bag of homemade cookies, and an envelope with $60 in cash. For soup and socks, her note read, "No shame in needing help." It wasn't just the money, it was the message, "I see you." A few days later, another unexpected name popped up, Miss Rodriguez, my old high school counselor. Somehow she'd heard I got into Westfield. "I always knew you had it in you," she said. "If you ever need help applying for grants or internships, call me." I didn't expect it. I hadn't asked, but it was the first time in a long time. Someone offered me something without strings, without judgment, without comparing me to anyone else. Even my RA, Mia, noticed. She started inviting me to late-night ramen runs, gently insisting I come. We sat on the dorm floor, knees touching, slurping noodles, and laughing about nothing. It wasn't deep, but it was warm, and warmth was rare. That week, something shifted in me. Not everything had to be earned. Not every kindness came with conditions. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone as I thought. It started small, like most good things do. Mia, my RA, began leaving little notes on our dorm door. "Soup night in the lounge, come hungry." "Mental health check-in, 10 p.m. tea provided." "You matter, that's it, that's the post." At first, I thought it was for everyone. Maybe it was. But every time I walked into those spaces, Mia would smile like she'd been waiting just for me. We weren't close at first. She was loud, funny, quick with sarcasm. I was quiet, cautious, always watching for signs of rejection. But one night, I found her in the hallway, crying softly into a pillow. She looked up and said, "Don't tell anyone I'm human, okay?" We laughed through the tears. That was the night we became real friends. Then there was Harper, my roommate. When she first arrived, I braced myself for tension. But Harper didn't compete. She didn't compare. She just existed beside me, gently. She played soft indie music at night and offered me tea without asking questions. She had a way of making silence feel safe. One afternoon, she came back to the room and saw me hunched over my laptop, surrounded by rejection emails from part-time jobs. Without saying a word, she pulled out a bag of cookies and slid them toward me. "Eat first, then cry, then apply again." We sat on the floor that day and talked for hours. About everything and nothing. About moms who only cared how things looked on the outside, about being tired of pretending, about feeling like imposters even when we worked twice as hard. Harper didn't try to fix me, she just stayed, and that meant more than any solution. Then came Professor Adams. He taught Entrepreneurship 101, and he noticed me before I realized I was being seen. After class one day, he pulled me aside. "You ask sharp questions," he said. "Ever thought of starting something of your own?" I laughed. "I can barely afford lunch," he smiled. "Then you'll make a brilliant founder. You already know how to stretch a dollar." He became my mentor before I even realized I needed one. He guided me through grant applications, invited me to attend a campus startup incubator, and pushed me to submit my ideas for a digital marketing service into a student-led competition. Not because I was the smartest, but because he believed I had something to say and that it deserved to be heard. Bit by bit, I stopped bracing for impact, stopped apologizing for existing, started accepting that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't hard to love. I'd just been loving in the wrong direction. None of these people shared my blood, but they showed up when no one else did. And that's when I realized sometimes the family that saves you is the one you get to choose. It started with a pitch typed at 1 a.m. between tutoring sessions and microwaved dinners. A digital marketing idea, basic, unpolished, but mine. I submitted it to Westfield's campus startup incubator thinking, what do I have to lose? Turns out I had everything to gain. Professor Adams reviewed my draft and added just one comment at the top. "You're not asking for permission, you're offering value. Own that." When I got the email saying I'd been accepted into the final 10, I didn't scream. I sat in silence, staring at the screen, letting the unfamiliar weight of deserved recognition settle on my chest. No one else clapped, but I did in my head. And that was enough. I called Grandma Martha first. "They picked my idea," I whispered. "Of course they did," she said without missing a beat. "Some people bloom late, but baby, you were never a seed. They just buried you too deep." That sentence rewrote something in me. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I turned my dorm into a war room. Harper handled the admin. Mia built the brand colors. I offered free consultations to local businesses just to prove we could deliver. A cafe signed on, then a florist, then a yoga studio. I watched something grow from nothing. No trust fund, no last name advantage, just grit, stubborn hope, and people who believed in me without needing a reason. My first invoice cleared, $120. I stared at it like it was $1 million. Because for a girl who used to count quarters for laundry, this wasn't just money, it was worth. It was value I had created with no permission slip, no approval stamp, no Sophia to compete with. When the final pitch day came, I wore a blazer 2 sizes too big and shoes that blistered my heels. But I stood tall. My voice didn't tremble. I talked about clients, community, and resilience, like I'd been born to lead, and maybe I had, just no one had told me. The judges asked hard questions. I answered harder. I didn't win out of sympathy. I won because I earned it. As they announced my name, national champion, I didn't think about calling home. I thought about Mia, who squeezed my hand. Harper, who teared up before I did. Professor Adams, who nodded like this had always been inevitable. I didn't need my parents' faces in the crowd, because the people who mattered were already standing. That night, walking back under a quiet sky, I whispered to myself, "You did this, without their money, without their praise, without their name, you." And for the first time, I didn't just feel proud, I felt free. The subject line hit harder than I expected. Congratulations, valedictorian, you've been chosen to speak at commencement. My heart skipped, then sank, then raced. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Not from shock, not from joy. From what it meant. Me, the girl who ate crackers for dinner, the girl who cried into laundry piles, the girl they said wasn't worth the tuition. Now I was being asked to speak for the entire graduating class, on a stage, in a gown, in front of thousands, and probably in front of them. My stomach twisted. David and Sarah Miller hadn't spoken to me in over a year. I'd left without a word, and they hadn't tried to follow. But a public speech? At Westfield, it would be hard for their pride to stay away. This wasn't just a speech anymore. It was a spotlight, and they might show up, not to celebrate, but to reclaim something. I closed my laptop and just sat there, staring at the wall, at nothing. My thoughts spun. Do I even want this? What if I freeze? What if they twist this into their victory? That night, I called Grandma Martha. They picked me, I whispered. Of course they did, she said. You've always had something to say. They just didn't want to listen. They might be there. A pause, then, so let them hear it this time. I didn't sleep. I lay awake replaying memories like a movie reel. Sophia's birthday cakes, my quiet report cards. The night they chose her and left me to figure it out. By morning, something had shifted. Later that week, Harper found me in the campus quad. Laptop open, document blank. Speech, she guessed. Avoiding it, I muttered. I told her about the email, the fear, the pressure, the ghosts I wasn't ready to face. She listened, really listened, then leaned in close. Maybe this isn't about them. Maybe this is the moment you take back the microphone they never gave you. What if I'm not ready? Chloe, she said softly, you've been writing this speech your entire life. That night, I lit a candle and opened a fresh document, and I wrote, "This is for the ones who were told they weren't enough and proved it wrong." The words poured out of me. I wasn't just telling my story, I was reclaiming it. This wouldn't be a speech to impress them. It would be a declaration that they no longer mattered. I didn't want revenge. I wanted release. And when I stepped onto that stage, I wouldn't be alone. I'd carry every version of myself who stayed silent, and I'd finally let her speak. I wasn't just writing a speech. I was setting the stage for a quiet detonation, not the kind that screams, the kind that echoes, slow, surgical, impossible to forget. I didn't want pity, I didn't want applause, I wanted truth, polished, measured, undeniable. So I began with what they expected, gratitude for the professors, the classmates, the community that helped me rise. Then, without warning, I shifted. I spoke of a girl, not named, not pointed at, who had been told she wasn't enough, who was reminded in subtle, consistent ways that her worth had to be proven while others were born with it. A girl who clawed her way into a place people said she didn't belong, and stood there without asking anyone's permission. I wrote every sentence like a thread, plain at the surface, barbed underneath. No anger, just precision. One line read, "Not all success stories start with support. Some start with silence and the refusal to accept it as permanent." Professor Adams read my draft in one sitting. "You're not holding back," he said. "Should I?" I asked. "No," he smiled. "This doesn't stab, it slices." Still, I had one more move. I requested that the university include a short line in the official ceremony introduction. Chloe Miller, first-generation, self-funded graduate, scholarship recipient, and founder of a student business initiative. Just that. No added emotion, no commentary. But to those who knew, especially them, it would be unmistakable. They'd hear every dollar I raised alone, every hour I worked to stay afloat, everything they didn't give. It was my ace in the hole. Simple, factual, devastating. Harper helped me rehearse. She marked where to pause, where to soften, where to strike. When I reached one particular line, she touched my arm. "That's the one," she said. "Say it without blinking." The line was this: validation doesn't always come from applause. Sometimes it comes from surviving long enough to give it to yourself. That one stayed with me. On the morning of commencement, I stood before the mirror, in cap and gown, hair neatly pinned, hands steady. For the first time, I saw someone who didn't look like she was trying to be enough. She looked like she knew she was. As I walked toward the auditorium, Mia met me at the door. "You ready?" "I'm not here to impress," I said. "I'm here to reclaim." Because this wasn't a performance, this was a line in the sand, not drawn in defiance, but in peace. And if they were in the crowd watching, I hoped they listened, not because I needed them to understand, but because I no longer needed their permission to speak. The auditorium pulsed with energy, anticipation hanging thick in the air. Rows of proud parents held up phones, craning for the best angle. Professors straightened their robes, names echoed, applause rolled like thunder, and flashbulbs painted the walls with artificial stars. Backstage, I stood completely still, not nervous, not shaken, just still, like the moment before lightning strikes. A coordinator gave me the nod. "You're next." I stepped into the lights. The applause hadn't started yet. That would come after the introduction, but the silence now felt heavier than any noise I'd known. I scanned the crowd. Third row, center, there they were, David and Sarah Miller. My mother sat stiff, lips tight, like she was bracing for a storm she couldn't name. My father's arms were folded. He wore the same expression he used to give my report cards. Measured boredom with a hint of skepticism. They didn't clap, not yet, but they were watching. Perfect. The dean stepped forward. "Introducing our valedictorian, Chloe Miller, first-generation, self-funded graduate, scholarship recipient, and founder of Westfield's Student Business Initiative." That line. It cracked through the room like quiet thunder. The applause came late, staggered, confused at first. Then it rose, wave after wave, until it filled the space completely. But I wasn't listening for volume. I was watching for faces. My father blinked. My mother's hands clenched in her lap. That one sentence had done what 4 years of silence couldn't. It exposed the gap, the difference, the truth. I walked slowly to the podium. Each step felt deliberate, grounded, like I was carving new territory with every movement. When I looked out into the crowd, I didn't flinch. 4 years ago, I began. I arrived at Westfield with 2 suitcases, a borrowed laptop, and a voice I hadn't learned how to use yet. A few people leaned forward. I wasn't the loudest. I wasn't the legacy. I didn't have a family cheering from the sidelines. I paused, eyes locked on the third row. But sometimes the people no one expects to succeed are the ones who rewrite the ending. My father shifted. My mother looked away. For the first time, they weren't in control of the room. They weren't the narrators. They were the audience. And I was the headline. But I didn't linger on them. I spoke to the ones who needed it, to the girl who used to fake smiles at family dinners, to the boy working night shifts to pay for textbooks, to every person who ever sat in silence, waiting for permission to exist louder. "This isn't just a degree," I said. "It's a declaration. That survival is strength. That success doesn't have to look like anyone else's story." And in that moment, I wasn't seeking approval. I was writing my own ending. One word at a time. I didn't need to raise my voice. The power wasn't in the volume. It was in the silence that followed every sentence. I had delivered the story. Let the room sit in it. Let them connect the dots without being told what they meant. That was always the trick. Make them feel it before they even understood it. The speech was almost done. But the most important part hadn't been said aloud, because it didn't need to be. I closed the folder slowly, deliberately. It wasn't for effect, it was for control. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to anyone. I was leading. The auditorium held its breath. And so did they. I could feel it, their attention shifting, not just the crowd, but them. Third row, center. My parents sat like they didn't know whether to brace or to vanish. He stared blankly, jaw rigid, arms locked across his chest. She looked everywhere but at me, at her shoes, at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but forward. I didn't call them out. That would have been too easy. Instead, I stood there a few extra seconds, made space for the things they never gave space for. Let the silence speak where they never let my voice rise. Because sometimes the most cutting thing you can do is hold your ground where they once erased it. And I did, not as an act of defiance, but as a declaration. I didn't have to explain myself anymore. Not to them, not to anyone. What I had built, this journey, this victory, this version of myself, had been assembled in the absence of their belief, their support, their presence. And that made it more mine than anything they could ever claim. The applause didn't come right away. It started with a single clap, then another, and then it rolled forward, like a wave I hadn't expected but had quietly craved. I stepped back from the mic and looked past the crowd, not to search for pride, but to confirm a truth I already knew. I didn't need them in this picture. They were in the frame by accident, but the spotlight was mine by design. As I descended the stairs, the audience stood. People I'd never met. Professors who had once passed me in the hallway. Friends who'd watched me fight quietly for years. They all rose. But in the third row, two shadows stayed seated. It was perfect. Because this time, I didn't look back to see if they stood. I didn't linger to hear if they clapped. That was their silence to carry now. And I had finally learned to stop making space for people who never chose to stand with me. Let them watch. From a distance they could never cross again. The sound of applause faded the moment I stepped off the stage, but the weight of it lingered, like the echo of something too big to hold inside my skin. I moved through the narrow hallway behind the auditorium, lights overhead humming faintly, footsteps muffled against worn carpet. Behind the curtain, the ceremony carried on, diplomas handed out, cheers rising in waves. But back here, time stretched, my body buzzed, not from nerves, but from the strange quiet that follows something irreversible. I took off my cap. My palms were damp, my throat dry. I hadn't stumbled, hadn't flinched. I had said what needed to be said. And yet, something inside me was still shaking. I leaned against the wall, letting the stillness settle. There was no triumph in this silence, only release, the kind that doesn't feel like celebration, the kind that feels like finally putting something down after carrying it too long. Then came footsteps, measured, familiar. I didn't have to look to know it was Sophia. She didn't announce herself, no dramatic entrance, no forced sentiment, just presence. She stood a few feet away, hands clasped loosely in front of her, eyes not quite meeting mine. For a moment, we didn't speak, and that moment said more than any words could have. There was no tension between us, no rivalry in the air, just a strange, fragile stillness. We had always been two pieces of a story told unevenly, one in bold ink, the other in faint pencil. But today, the page had turned. I finally looked at her. Not through the lens of memory, but through now. She looked different, not older, not wiser, but aware. Not of everything, but of enough. She didn't apologize, didn't try to make sense of years she couldn't rewrite. And somehow that made her presence feel more honest. She stood beside me, not close enough to crowd, but not far enough to ignore. It felt like the first time we had ever occupied the same space, without performing for someone else. No competition, no comparisons. Just two daughters who had grown up inside the same house and walked out with different wounds. After a minute, she nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, not just of what I had said, but of what I had survived. Then she left. No hug, no promises, no false repair. But for the first time, her absence didn't sting. Because it wasn't rejection. It was space. Space I had finally claimed. Space she was learning to respect. And in that quiet hallway, I realized something I hadn't expected to feel. Not forgiveness, not connection, but peace. They waited until the crowd had thinned, when the air was softer, and the buzz of celebration had dulled into polite chatter and closing doors. I was standing near the edge of the courtyard, letting the sunlight fall on my face, when I saw them. David and Sarah Miller. They weren't walking toward me with open arms or bright smiles. They were standing still, too still, like people preparing to step into water they hadn't tested yet. I didn't move. Eventually they came closer. There was hesitation in every step. Not regret, not even guilt. Just calculation. A kind of emotional math they were used to doing. Except this time, the equation had changed, and they knew it. The first words out of their mouths were pleasantries, dipped in politeness, dressed in thin compliments about how I carried myself and spoke so well. But it all sounded like it came from someone else's mouth. Nothing about the past, nothing about what mattered. And then, quietly, the offer came. Help, support, assistance, a word too sanitized to carry any meaning anymore. It was dressed up in concern, packaged like something generous, but it arrived too late, without roots, without weight. And it was conditional, not spoken outright, but written in every pause, every sideways glance, every unspoken expectation. They wanted proximity, now that there was something to stand beside. Now that there was proof, but they weren't here to acknowledge who I had become. They were here to reclaim what they had lost control of. I listened. I didn't interrupt, not out of respect, but out of clarity, because this was the moment I had spent years preparing for. Not the speech, not the stage. This, to stand in front of them and feel nothing pulling me back. When they finished, I smiled, small, controlled, real. And then I shook my head. There was no scene, no harsh words, no drawn-out refusal. Just that one small gesture, final, quiet, unmistakable. Their faces didn't crumble, they stiffened. They weren't used to being turned away without drama. But that was the difference now. I didn't need fire to say no. I didn't need noise to close the door. I turned before they could speak again. Walked away with the applause still echoing faintly behind me, the sun now full on my shoulders. This wasn't revenge, this was return. To myself, to the boundary that had never been respected, and now would never again be crossed. And if they stood behind me, wondering what had changed, they didn't understand that change had never required their understanding. Only my decision. The first morning after graduation, I woke up in silence. No alarms, no emails, no expectations. Just the soft rustle of wind through the open window and the weightless feeling of a life that for once belonged only to me. I didn't check my phone. I didn't think about who had or hadn't sent messages. There was no need. The weight I'd carried for years, the tight coil in my chest, the invisible thread tying me back to their approval, was gone. It hadn't vanished in a dramatic moment. It had loosened quietly, thread by thread, until it simply wasn't there anymore. That morning I made coffee in my tiny apartment, still half furnished, still smelling like fresh paint and possibility. I opened the window and let the light spill in. There were no voices asking why I wasn't doing something more practical. No eyes comparing me to someone else. No undertones reminding me I wasn't enough. Just air and freedom and a body that no longer flinched at quiet. I sat at the table with my laptop and opened a folder labeled Expansion Plan Q3. It wasn't a school assignment. It was mine, my business, my future. Clients had started coming in steadily, referrals, returning brands, small businesses that now trusted my judgment without questioning my experience. I had a wait list, I had income, I had impact, but more than that, I had peace, the kind that doesn't come from applause or praise, but from knowing no one can take credit for what you've built. In the afternoons, I walked around the neighborhood without headphones, just listening to traffic, to birds, to the steady rhythm of my own thoughts. For so long I had lived with noise, external and internal. Now even my silence felt earned. Sometimes Harper would drop by, with tea and leftovers, kick off her shoes, and sprawl across my couch like we'd been roommates for life. She didn't ask questions. She didn't probe. She just existed beside me in the most comfortable way. We didn't need to talk about what happened, because we had both seen it. And more importantly, we had both lived beyond it. Evenings were my favorite. I'd light a candle, open my journal, and write, not for grades or approval or someone else's eyes, but for myself, for the girl who used to hide her notebooks under her bed because no one ever asked to see them. Now I wrote without fear, without shame. Not everything was perfect. There were still days when the past crept in uninvited, but it no longer dictated the terms of my peace. Because this time I was living a life no one gave me. I had taken it, bit by bit, breath by breath, and I wasn't giving it back. Healing didn't come in a grand gesture. It arrived like dust settling, quiet, slow, almost unnoticeable, until one day I realized I was breathing differently. It began with the decision to stop surviving. I didn't make an announcement. I just started living like the war was over. I booked my first therapy session on a Tuesday afternoon. No crisis, no breakdown, just a quiet question echoing inside me. What if I didn't have to carry it all alone anymore? The office was small. The walls were soft blue. The chair creaked when I sat. I didn't cry, not at first. I talked about facts, dates, events, like reading off a resume of pain I had rehearsed in silence for years. But then came the moments I hadn't prepared for. The pause before I said they didn't even open my acceptance letter. The way my throat tightened when I said, I used to time my footsteps to avoid being noticed. No one interrupted. No one defended them. No one told me to see it differently. And for the first time, I began to believe that maybe I wasn't being dramatic. Maybe I had been hurt. And maybe that mattered. Outside of therapy, I rebuilt my life with small rituals that felt like stitching. I lit candles in the morning just to let the scent remind me I was safe. I played music while folding laundry, not to distract, but to accompany. I bought real plates, I cooked real food. I set the table for one and still made it beautiful. I wrote pages and pages, sometimes sentences, sometimes just words, enough, chosen, safe, real. I stopped explaining my boundaries. I just kept them. I stopped measuring my worth in productivity. I let rest become sacred. Some days healing felt like a sunrise. Some days it felt like pulling weeds with bleeding hands. But every day it felt more like mine. I reached out to the people who had shown up when I couldn't stand. A surprise bouquet to Harper, a handwritten letter to Grandma Martha, an email to Professor Adams titled, "Thank you for everything you never asked me to prove." I even opened the old sketchbooks, the ones I'd hidden beneath my mattress growing up. They were messy, uneven, beautiful in their desperation. I didn't flinch. I didn't grieve the girl who made them. I honored her. Because she created light with no permission, no applause, no audience. She drew a future no one could yet see, except maybe her. And now I was living it. I wasn't healed, not entirely, but I was no longer broken, just someone learning how to live without armor. And finally realizing I had skin strong enough to feel the world and still stay whole. I used to think family was something you were born into. Now I think it's something you build, slowly, deliberately, like a house with hands that don't always know how to hold a hammer, but keep showing up anyway. The people who stayed weren't tied to me by blood. They didn't owe me love. They gave it anyway. Harper started coming over on Sunday nights with a bottle of wine and zero expectations. We didn't need to talk about the past. Sometimes we watched old sitcoms. Sometimes we sat in silence, our laughter more therapy than any words could offer. Sometimes we made dinner and burned it and ordered pizza instead. She never asked how I was healing. She just assumed I would, and left space for it to happen. Mia dropped off a potted plant with a sticky note that said, "Let something else grow with you." It still sits on my kitchen windowsill. It's not thriving, but it's still alive. And somehow that feels like enough. Professor Adams invited me to guest speak at one of his seminars. Not because I'd won anything big, not because he wanted a trophy to show off, but because he trusted my story to mean something, to someone. When I walked into the lecture hall, he smiled and handed me the mic, like it had always belonged to me. Afterward, he said, "Your voice is sharper now, but softer too. You've learned how to cut without bleeding." I didn't reply, I just smiled. Grandma Martha sent a postcard every month. Not long letters, just a line or two, always in her neat, tilted handwriting. "You are still becoming." "I like who you're turning into." "Proud" doesn't even cover it. I pinned them to the side of my fridge, where I could see them every morning. They were my quiet inheritance, a legacy written not in will or money, but in belief. We didn't replace what I had lost. We built something new in its place. And the more I leaned into these connections, the more I realized love doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it shows up in late-night soup, in shared silence, in an open door, in the sentence, "Text me when you get home." No performance, no proving, just presence. And for the first time in my life, I understood something I had never dared to believe. I wasn't hard to love. I had just been loving in the wrong direction. Now I was facing forward. And the people in front of me weren't asking me to shrink. They were holding out their hands, not to carry me, but to walk with me. The invitation came in a plain white envelope, tucked under my door with no return address. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. The handwriting was hers, curved, controlled. familiar in a way that no longer hurt. It was for a family event, an anniversary, or maybe a birthday. I didn't read the details too carefully. What mattered wasn't the occasion. What mattered was how I felt holding the envelope. Nothing, no tightening in my chest, no impulse to prove I was too busy, too important, no anger, no nostalgia, just paper, and the freedom to choose. I went, not to reconnect, not to forgive, but because I no longer needed to avoid them to protect myself. I wore what made me feel grounded. I walked in without scanning the room. I didn't rehearse anything. I wasn't there for confrontation. I was there as a guest, not a daughter trying to be seen. The house hadn't changed much. Still the same floral wallpaper. Still the same uneven picture frames. But I had. They noticed it before I said a word. There was a pause when I entered, short but sharp enough to cut through small talk. People who once barely acknowledged me now offered soft smiles, unsure greetings, hesitant hugs. I nodded politely. I didn't linger. My parents were across the room. They saw me. I saw them. No one moved. It didn't feel cold. It felt done. We spoke briefly, surface level. Weather, work, polite acknowledgments of time passing. No apologies, no attempts to rewrite history. Just the dull rhythm of people who used to matter in a different way. And when the conversation ended, it ended without ceremony. No bitterness, no lingering ache. Just two people I had once tried to love into becoming someone else. Now I didn't need them to change, because I had. I stepped outside after an hour. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the driveway. I stood there for a moment, not thinking about what had just happened, but about where I was going next. Harper had saved me a seat at her rooftop dinner. Mia was bringing wine. Grandma Martha had sent cookies in the mail. My people were waiting, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I looked back at the house one last time, not with resentment, not with longing, just stillness, a full circle moment that no longer required anything of me. I got in the car, turned the engine, and drove away without music. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of peace, of presence, of the kind of closure that doesn't come with words, only with walking away and not needing to be followed. There was no defining moment, no grand finale, no dramatic release, just space. And the quiet knowing that I had finally stepped into my own life. I used to think healing would look like forgiveness, like walking back into the same rooms and being able to breathe again. But it's not that, not for me. Healing, as it turns out, is subtler. It's choosing not to flinch when their names come up. It's hearing your own voice in a room full of noise and trusting it. It's waking up and no longer needing to prove you survived. I look back now, not to grieve, not to measure, just to see how far I've come. There was a version of me who thought silence was strength, who tried to earn love by disappearing just enough to become acceptable. I mourn her, but I don't miss her, because the woman who stands here now doesn't need to be chosen. She chooses. She chooses where to walk, who to let in, what to carry, and what to set down without apology. I no longer wait for apologies. I no longer need explanations. Some things were broken on purpose, and some people taught me how to rebuild simply by never showing up. I used to dream of what ifs. What if they'd believed in me? What if they'd said they were proud? But the real freedom came when I stopped wanting the version of them that only existed in my imagination. I stopped trying to rewrite them, and instead I rewrote myself, piece by piece, boundary by boundary, choice by choice. There's a different kind of love now, one that doesn't demand perfection, one that shows up in leftovers, shared over cheap wine, in midweek check-ins, in text messages that say, "Just thinking of you." I found family in people who never needed me to earn it. And I became someone I actually enjoy coming home to. So if you're standing where I once stood, in the quiet, in the ache, in the wondering, I want you to hear this. You are not difficult. You are not too much. You are not invisible. You are just living in a story that wasn't written for you. But you get to change that. Today. In small ways, in real ways, because survival is not the end. It's the beginning, and thriving. Thriving is learning to tell your story out loud, even if your voice shakes, even if no one claps, even if they never say they were wrong. You speak anyway, you walk anyway, you choose yourself anyway. And that's where everything changes. Have you ever been made to feel invisible by the people who were supposed to love you most? Maybe you've carried the silence too long. Maybe you're still learning how to let go of the weight that was never yours. If this story touched something in you, leave a comment. Share your story, or just say, "I understand." You're not alone, and you don't have to keep quiet anymore.